I prefer to use my hands. Hello everyone, and welcome to day 21 of Terrorthon's Splatter films. You may not be familiar with that term, but you'll certainly be familiar with the term that's coming up a little bit later in the video when we get to it. So what exactly is a splatter film? It's very similar to a slasher, but it relies heavily on gore, and usually there's buckets of blood and lots of mutilations, and it's just really charming stuff. So let's get into the origins of the splatter film. So the first appearance of gore ever was in a movie called Intolerance in 1916, in which we see 2 decapitations and a soldier being stabbed in the abdomen by a spear. Now, the origins of splatter films are pretty much the same as the origins of slasher films, which we've covered, so we're going to skip all the way to 1960, when the most gory film of all time was considered to be a film called Jigoku by a Japanese director, Nobu Nakagawa, which featured flaying and dismemberment. Lovely. And then in 1963, the first ever splatter movie came out, Blood Feast by Herschel Gordon Lewis, who was mentioned in the slasher video as well. Like I said, a lot of crossover. Before long, critics were taking notice of all the blood and guts being showed to them, such as Roger Ebert and a UK Member of Parliament known as Graham Bright. They wanted splatter films censored. Roger Ebert in particular went after the movie I Spit on Your Grave, and Graham Bright introduced the Video Recordings Act in the UK. And before long, these splatter films were known as video nasties, according to the UK press, so that's where that term came from. And then, almost 20 years later, a little-known director called Peter Jackson directed the movies Bad Taste in 1987, and Brain Dead, or Dead Alive, depending on where you're from, in 1992. And the gore in these movies was so over the top that an entirely new term was born, splatstick. Splatstick was very common in Japan with the likes of The Machine Girl, Robo Geisha, and Tokyo Gore Police, which I've mentioned before. I recommend that movie very much. Splatter also influenced other genres, such as the found footage genre, with the likes of Cannibal Holocaust, which directly inspired the Blair Witch Project. And then, the more popular term of today was born in around 2003, torture porn. Now, splatter and torture porn are the same thing, it's just a more modern term for these kind of movies. Torture porn combines splatter and slasher genres, but as I say, they're essentially the same thing. In 2005, Eli Roth released Hostel, which was the first movie to ever be named torture porn, but after the term was born, Saw and all of its sequels were later labelled as that as well. And other older movies also had the term applied to them, such as Ichi the Killer by Takashi Miike, which came out in 2001, The Devil's Rejects by Rob Zombie, and Wolf Creek, which came out in 2005. They were later labelled as torture porn as well. But the thing is, torture porn, despite being so disgusting, it was actually a very profitable genre. Like, for example, Saw made over 100 times its budget back in profits, which was over $100 million gross, and Hostel made 16 times its budget back, and before long, Saw became the most profitable horror franchise of all time, which still stands today. As you can imagine, due to the heavy levels of gore, there was a lot of public outcry about these movies, and a lot of marketing for torture porn movies was simply taken down in many locations. But the director of Hostel, Eli Roth, defended the genre. Stephen King said, yes, it makes you uncomfortable, but good art should make you uncomfortable. But it had its detractors as well, such as George A. Romero, who said that torture porn movies are lacking metaphor. Because it was so profitable, torture porn actually crossed into genres other than horror, such as the crime thriller I Know Who Killed Me, which came out in 2007. And then around the mid-2000s, a new subgenre was born, which was called the New French Extremity, and it included such films as Inside, which came out in 2007, and Martyrs, which came out in 2008. And then around 2009, torture porn movies began to be replaced by horror remakes. Big surprise. But it kept going with the likes of Human Centipede in 2009 and a Serbian film in 2010. But at this point, a lot of these movies were getting banned, such as Grotesque and The Bunny Game, which were banned by the British Board of Film Classification. Pretty much since those movies, torture porn releases were DVD oriented, they didn't come out in theatres, and the genre is mostly dead nowadays. But it is a very important part of the puzzle that is the history of horror, and love them or hate them, they were incredibly profitable, and who knows, maybe one day it will come back, although I hope not too soon. See you tomorrow.